The term in question, Deuteronomistic history, as used in the context of biblical studies, is a product of modern scholarship and did not exist in earlier times. We can say that the term itself is an invention of modern biblical scholarship. This hypothesis suggests that the book of Deuteronomy to Kings were a deliberately crafted historical work, attributed either to a single author or to a redactor. Now, to fully understand the Deuteronomistic history hypothesis and its current debates, it is essential to explore its genesis and subsequent developments through a brief history of past research. Now, I'm not going to bore you with so much detail, but I would cover enough so that you're comfortable with this hypothesis because it's extremely important to where we are going. So, this exploration can be divided into 3 parts. Number 1, the period before Notes' contribution. Number 2, Notes' invention of the Deuteronomistic history. And then number 3, the scholarly discourse since Notes' time. Okay, you should be asking, who is this Note fellow that everything seems to surround? Martin Note is widely regarded as the father of the Deuteronomistic history hypothesis. However, it is important to note that Note was not the first scholar to discuss Deuteronomistic redactions, as evidenced by the 3-part explorations that I've outlined. There was a period before him. In 1943, Note published his work, The Deuteronomistic History, but it did not start with Note. At the outset, the former prophets received considerably less attention in Jewish and Christian interpretations of the Bible than the Pentateuch, the 5 books. In fact, the latter is considered to be at the very center of the Hebrew Bible in both traditions, which is the Pentateuch. Consequently, books such as Joshua, Judges, Samuel, and Kings have always remained relatively obscure in comparison. The rabbis attempted to assign authorship of these texts to major characters or contemporaries of related events. For instance, they attributed authorship of Joshua to Joshua himself. Samuel and Judges were attributed to Samuel. And then 1st to 2nd Kings were attributed to Jeremiah the prophet, with a few exceptions such as Deuteronomy 34, where Moshe was not credited as its author. Interestingly, the rabbis did have some considerations that could be seen as anticipating the conclusion of modern historical criticism. For instance, since both Joshua and Samuel are reported to have died before the end of their respective books, the Talmud, that is the Babylonian Talmud, in Tractate Baba Batra, assumed that later redactors had completed these texts. It's very important. Additionally, the attribution of Kings to Jeremiah implies that the rabbis may have been aware of stylistic similarities between the book and Jeremiah's writings. I repeat that because it's important. The book of Kings was attributed to Jeremiah. This attribution implies that the rabbis may have been aware of stylistic similarities between this book, the Book of Kings, and Jeremiah's writings. However, despite these insights, the rabbis largely overlooked linguistic, stylistic, and ideological affinities between Joshua, Judges, Samuel, and Kings. They overlooked it. Moreover, little attention was given to the fact that Deuteronomy serves as an introduction to Joshua's conquest narrative. Instead, Jewish and Christian commentators were preoccupied with reconciling conflicting texts or justifying morally questionable behaviors by biblical figures such as Jephthah sacrificing his daughter or David killing a woman's husband to be with her. It wasn't until the 16th century that a truly critical investigation of the former prophets began to emerge. John Calvin's commentary on Joshua challenges the notion that Joshua himself wrote the book named after him. According to Calvin, the presence of different writing styles and consistent use of third-person references to Joshua suggest otherwise. Instead, he proposes that Eleazar, a contemporary priest of Joshua, could have compiled the book from various documents at his disposal. Although Calvin denies authorship to Joshua directly, he still situates the author in the time period of events related in the book. Andreas Macius, a Catholic scholar, held a more radical view regarding the authorship of Joshua. In his critical edition of the Greek and Hebrew texts of Joshua in 1574, he posits that Ezra should be considered the ultimate compiler, not only of Joshua, but also Judges and Kings. This implies that Macius places the final redaction of the historical books in the Persian era, specifically during the 5th to 4th century BCE. Baruch Spinoza, a Jewish philosopher who lived a century later, shares the same perspective as Macius regarding the collection spanning from Genesis to Kings. He perceived the Pentateuch and former prophets as a unified composition. However, Spinoza also highlights that the book of Deuteronomy provides an ideological foundation for interpreting subsequent history. Let me repeat that in clear terms. Spinoza points out that the book of Deuteronomy serves as an ideological foundation for understanding and interpreting subsequent events in history. This means that Spinoza has already recognized the Deuteronomistic nature of the book that come after Deuteronomy. This marks the beginning of ideological criticism, where the biblical writer's record is no longer unanimously accepted as being divinely inspired, but rather becomes a topic of debate. In his book, The Moral Philosopher, Thomas Morgan delves into the personalities and motivations of the protagonists in the historical books. According to Morgan, Samuel's negative attitude towards monarchy can easily be explained by his selfish fear of losing power. King David despite being widely revered, was actually one of the bloodiest tyrants in history. On the other hand, King Ahab and his wife Jezebel, who are portrayed as wicked in the book of Kings, were actually exemplars of tolerance and were right to oppose fanatics like the prophet Elijah. A French philosopher, Voltaire, shares a similar perspective on the extermination of the Canaanites in the book of Joshua and David's political maneuvers as highly immoral. As a result, by the end of the 18th century, traditional Jewish and Christian views on the former prophets were being challenged. It became clear that Deuteronomy and the former prophets could not have been written contemporaneously with related events. Additionally, there was insight into the ideological choices which formed the basis of Israel's history, an idea that was already present in Spinoza's work. With these options intrinsically connected to and heavily influenced by Deuteronomy. These findings laid a foundation for critical exegesis in the 19th century.